Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ki tēnei hui, ki te mana whenua rangitāne, he mihi nui. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morning and welcome to the Planning and Strategy Committee for the 10th of November. First up, we will call for apologies. We've got an apology from the Mayor and Councillor Bowen for early departure on council business, and an apology from Councillor McCarlid. Are there any other apologies? Great, well I will move that we receive the apologies, seconded by Councillor Hancock, and I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. I haven't had notification of any additional items. Are there any declarations of interest?
Excuse me, Madam Chair, it's not a declaration of interest. I'm just wondering, do we need our masks on, since we've got members of the public in the gallery?
We've had an exception because Ms Whaipu's an appointed member.
Okay, so we don't need our masks on. Okay, thank you.
I haven't had notification of any public comment, and I don't believe we've got anyone online waiting. So moving on to the confirmation of minutes on page 7, I will move that the minutes of the Planning and Strategy Committee meeting of the 20th October 2021 Part 1 Public be confirmed as a true and correct record, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Thank you. Are there any comments? Councillor Johnson.
Just a question, Madam Chair. Where it states the people who, under 3521, were present with Ms Georgina Murrow, it lists 5 different people, but as far as I can recall, only 2 people spoke. So I'm not quite sure whether that's correct to list all those other people as having made the presentation.
Yes, they introduced themselves at the beginning of the presentation and said that they were there in support. So 2 people spoke, but it was essentially that group of 5 presenting.
Okay, so we're happy that that's accurate then?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? Is anyone wishing to make comment? Great, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 14 in favour with 1 abstention. Moving on to item 6, the proposal from Ngāti Hiniotea Hapu Authority, Kohangareo, to relocate to the Opi Reserve. We have Kathy and Michael coming to speak to that.
Thank you. We'll take the report as read, and we're both here to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Sorry, just getting used to the microphone in the back benches here. I've got 3 lines of questioning. So the first one, Kathy, is, and Michael, is around the process here. So is this an initiative that has been brought to us from the Trust, or is this an initiative that council officers have worked on to bring to us, if you see what I mean? Like where this has originated?
It is an initiative that was brought to us by the Trust that they were looking to relocate. We have been working with them for over a year on potential sites. This is a site that they identified because of its location and proximity to the current kahongareo, and then we investigated the site.
Okay. So how does that fit in with other groups that have also asked us for council land for premises for their community facility? So I'm thinking in particular in the locality of the MMA group that were interested in the Amberley Avenue Scout Hut land and were unsuccessful because the judo club went out there, and also the Manawatu Gym Club that have recently been here asking for council land for their premises. So I suppose I'm not particularly asking you to speak to those two examples, but they're just a couple of examples that come to mind of groups that are also looking for council land, and how fulfilling this request today looks to them, if you know what I mean.
Yes, certainly, I do know what you mean. The Amberley Scout issue is slightly different. They were looking to occupy a building that wasn't owned by council. A council just needed to agree to them then leasing the land on which that building sat. In the case of the gym sport or any other group that comes forward, we have a process that we follow through, and council has recently passed a policy that looks at that and gives consideration to the strategic direction, and we work through a process. We've worked through that process with this group.
So well, you continue to use gym sports as an example just because they're top of mind. So if gym sports were to challenge us and say, well, why is council allowing the trust, the kahongareo, to have this particular piece of land when we're also in the queue for a piece of land, how would we respond to that?
So this report has been brought forward to council on the understanding that council will give the officers direction that they'd like to pursue this option based on the information you have in front of you. We have thoroughly looked at this site. If council was of the mind to look at every opportunity that may come up now or in the future, then we probably would have difficulty making any decisions around these things, because they do continually come up from time to time. Each time one comes up, we look at the needs of the group. In this particular case, this is the third site we've looked at with this group.
Okay. So just to move on then, in terms of the Kāinga Ora plans for housing redevelopment in the area, they have yet to produce a plan, is my understanding. So they're working on a plan at the moment, is that correct?
That is correct, but it is quite well advanced.
Okay, so do we have an idea of how, because I'm aware that there was some talk in the past about council potentially partnering with Kāinga Ora so that this land could be used for state housing potentially. So do we have an idea whether, if we were to make this decision today, whether that would have an impact on their plans in that area, or is it entirely independent?
So there's no intention for council to make the extra piece of land available for state housing. What council officers understand is that the wide area is being redeveloped for housing, so we're looking to work with Kāinga Ora on their plans for the wider area. No decision's been made yet about what type of housing, who might own it, who might develop this land. But once we get a direction from council that you'd like to investigate housing, we will then start to open up those discussions with the government agencies.
Okay, thank you. So our own social housing plans are in flux at the moment because we're just coming to the end of the Papuia Place redevelopment, and we've got money in the budget for social housing in years 3, 4 and 5. Sorry, for our own council housing in years 3, 4 and 5. Has any decision been made about, well, no, in fact, I know we haven't made a decision, but is the land at Opi Place a possible site for council to develop its own housing?
Yes, it absolutely is, and the next report that would come back to council would be looking at options, including options where council is the owner of the land and the type of housing that might be part of that. So all of those options have not been investigated because we first needed a council decision that you'd like to investigate housing for the site.
Okay, because in the report there's no option that we retain either all or half of the land for building council housing. It just talks about selling the land for development.
That's not how I interpreted it as reading it. It was to come back to council with options for the balance of the land.
Okay, cool. And then just finally, thanks for your indulgence, Madam Chair. In terms of our bigger picture planning around reserves, I'm aware at the moment that we seem to be looking at underutilised reserves in quite a piecemeal sort of a way. So it's kind of like one at a time, you know, so Huya Street and then Summerhays and then now this one. And I wonder if there's an overall picture or strategy on how we're dealing with underutilised reserves to make sure that we're not making piecemeal type decisions, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I do know. I'll just comment and then get Michael to comment further on that. I do know what you mean. In this particular case, we went back to the 2012 property review, and this piece of land was identified in that review as underutilised land at that stage. But I'll pass on to Michael about the resolution you've passed recently and how that might play out in a wider strategic.
One of the recommendations that came through in the housing capacity assessment back in June was to investigate those opportunities to look at underutilised reserve land. There is another piece of work under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development that requires councils to prepare a future development strategy, and that's the sort of work that would be included in that piece of work. So it'd be a more holistic look at housing across the city, what intensification looks like, taking into consideration the greenfield proposals that we're looking to bring online shortly, but also that underutilised reserve land.
Okay, I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Bowen.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you both for the report. Just one question. My reading of the report, and apologies if I lost track of this in it, the Kohanga-Reo requested initially the whole of the reserve, and the recommendation is for them to have half. So how have we established that their requirements can be met within half of the reserve rather than the whole?
The requirements can be met in half the reserve. There was a desire from the hapu to have the whole reserve, basically providing future opportunities for them. But the current facilities could be accommodated on half the reserve.
Has that been the subject of a conversation with the hapu or with Kohanga-Reo?
Yes, it has been a subject of conversation. Most definitely that's been between Chris and Jason Pilkington. And that has really been around what the absolute needs are and what the site currently occupy and what they would need to meet the Ministry of Education guidelines, and the desire to be able to have future opportunities to expand further. And so there's a balance to be had between those two things.
So to go with the half-size option, what period of growth does that allow for the Kohanga-Reo? How long will that last them on current numbers?
It would probably last them their immediate needs, is my understanding. I guess the difficulty with this one, councillors, is the balancing up of two strategic directions that you've given us. You've given us a direction around looking at housing and obviously the strategic direction that we have in working with Rangatane, and in particular the Ngāti Hiniatu hapu on their particular requirements. And the options you have before you are a balance of those two things.
So if this proposal meets the immediate needs of the Kohanga-Reo and the 18 children that they expect to have available, what would happen if they outgrow this site as well?
I don't know the answer to that, because that's a discussion they'd have to have with the Ministry of Education around licensing. It's not just the numbers, it's also the other provisions for their buildings and their licensing and their teaching and their ratios. And I'm not all over those guidelines with the Ministry.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for the report. Just for my own knowledge, the Scout Hall that was relocated in about 15 years ago, do we know whether that was initiated by the council or on their own request?
On their own request.
And did we provide an alternative site to them?
No, the site was no longer needed by them and they wished to bring their lease to an end, and the Scout Hall was moved off at the end of their lease.
Thank you. Just one more question, if you allow me. If somebody asks me that what is the definition of underutilized reserve, what should I tell them?
So when, within the report, you'll see there's some criteria there that were discussed during the 2012 property review. And at the moment, those are the only criteria that Council has established for what we would consider underutilised. Certainly as part of the work that, with the housing work that Michael has mentioned earlier, then underutilised and the criteria which match up with that would have to be defined. At the moment, we look at two things for whether we say that a piece of reserve land is needed or not. One is its fit within the network and its proximity and other things that are available, and the other is the current use of the site by the local community or any groups. We would consider that site to be underutilised because it isn't largely used for anything except for passing through. It's not it has no development on it whatsoever. It is just an open green space.
Okay, do we monitor these places in terms of counting numbers, using or going away, visiting the sites?
No, that's not presently part of the work that the council does.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Hapera.
Thanks, Madam Chair. My questioning was along the lines of where Councillor Butt was going, was the formula that was used for calculating underutilised land. Was there a formula?
No, there isn't a formula. Again, councillors, I bring you back to the 2012 property review, where it was a very large review and a very methodical process, and this was a reserve that was identified as part of that property review. We looked at that and said, has anything changed since that time? And nothing had, so we made the conclusion that because nothing had changed, and at that time it was considered by council to be underutilised, that it was still underutilised.
Thank you.
Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Kathy and Michael. Just a couple of questions. The hapu, I understand that there's also the urban marae, which is part of the report, and also focus on Rangatane culture throughout. That's been part of the discussions as well?
No, that is a separate discussion, and it's certainly not something that's been discussed for this site.
Okay, yet it talks about a strategic plan and direction. So I know there's been almost generational ask and wants for an urban marae for this hapu. So this site would not be suitable for that?
No, this site wouldn't be suitable for that. Certainly, and I mean, I'm obviously speaking with Chris sitting behind me, and he has a better understanding what their needs are. But if I could relay the discussions, the aspiration for the urban marae are somewhat larger than what this site would be able to accommodate, and within a residential area, there would be difficulty accommodating some of the activities that they would wish to have in a traditional urban marae.
Okay, so the report really, 2.12 really is. Why is it in the report?
So that was put into the report to just talk about the strategic plan and the 3 items that were on their strategic plan at the time, and one of those was focus on engaging with te reo. We didn't think it was appropriate to exclude the other 2 items of the strategic plan in making that point.
Okay, so just to be really crystal clear, this is not about an urban marae?
Indeed, it is not about an urban marae.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one question left. With the Housing Steering Group, we've discussed Opi Place with Kaingaora and ourselves, and you mentioned that Kaingaora are quite advanced in their planning. So have we sat down with Kaingaroa and looked at the whole area as far as possible partnerships with Kaingaroa?
Yeah, so my understanding is that they're looking at the wider area, and whilst they may not have determined the type of housing, they obviously fits within their wider network for Palmerston North. The intention from this paper is to get direction from Council that we then sit down with the Department of Conservation and Kaingaroa and begin those types of discussions.
So what I'm concerned about today, if we give direction regarding the Kauhanga Rio, in the bigger plan, I'm just wondering whether we should take a step back and look at the whole area and see how we could accommodate housing in the Kauhanga Rio in the whole Kauhanga
I
Rio,
guess I would just draw your attention to the commentary from Kaingaroa about this proposal, and we had that discussion about this proposal on that site, and they were very supportive because they felt it fulfilled a community need within the housing area that they were developing, and it was very compatible with what they were planning.
Okay, I'll wait for comment, thank you.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for this report. I've got two lines of questioning. The first one is, you say that you've been talking with the Trust for longer than a year, and that this is the third site. What has been the barriers so far to getting them an appropriate site?
The barriers have been two things. One have been the desire to stay within the community that they serve, and the second barrier has been the appropriateness of the activity with other things that are already at the reserves. So this is a early childcare facility which is not compatible under the Reserve Act with recreation, and so it's something that we would need a consent for anyway, but we have to give consideration to how the rest of the reserve is used. And one of the sites that we looked at, which would have been quite compatible, not in the neighbourhood, but quite compatible with other activities, the site was just not big enough to accommodate an activity of this type. So those have been the barriers.
Okay. And then I guess my second line of questioning is around the second half of it, I suppose. Has there been any discussions around trying to do papakainga type housing development with Ngāti Hinaoti?
No, until we had some direction from Council that they wanted to repurpose land for housing, we have not entered any discussions with any party about the nature of the housing or who might own that housing or how it may be developed.
So when we're looking at these different options here, because there's, I think 5 of them, would going down the route of, I guess, option 5 or even option 2, would some of these options eliminate the ability to provide a papakainga type housing development in that area?
No, they wouldn't. The option to have part of the land to be used for the Kauhanga Rio would prevent that area of land from being used for housing. But again, I repeat that the nature of the housing or the type of development for the balance of the land, we have not had any discussions into that or investigated options.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Cathy and Michael. Look, I just want to make sure that we've got some clarity around this. The Kaingaroa plan goes beyond the Opi Reserve. Is that correct?
Yes, it does. It goes over the whole neighbourhood. And
Kaingaroa's view is that through their expanded planning for the area, the Kauhanga Rio is something which is aligned with that development?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
The Mayor asked part of my question, but in your discussions with Ngāti Hinaoti, has there been any talk about what they could see the use of the other half of the land, other than the Kaingara? Have they discussed their views of what they could possibly see them using that bit of land for in the future?
No, the discussions with Ngāti Hini-o-tu have been around the Kahongareo.
No other ideas were put forward?
No, and we've been discussing it with the hapu. We haven't been discussing the wider area with rangatane. I think that's important to make that distinction here too.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Michael. I guess a further clarifying question around an area that's been quite well explored by colleagues, but just in the third recommendation where it speaks to options for the balance of Opi Reserve. In some prospects, one of those options is obviously the four little sections that's sort of identified within the report. But can we expect, if this recommendation is voted through, that also some of those options will explicitly extend beyond the balance of Opi Reserve to the wider picture?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure the question. Can you repeat the question, or I'm not quite sure what you're asking me?
Thanks. I'm trying to understand when we talk about options for the balance of the reserve, will some of those options be looking beyond the boundary of the reserve to these wider redevelopment plans that Kāinga Ora and or other entities might have in that area?
No, the intent was that the options that will be brought back will be for the balance of the reserve, because that is what council owns and what council has control over. However, the options will give consideration to the wider development and how that links in with the housing needs in the city. So the strategic direction and the responses and the recommendations that you have passed previously around housing will be considered in the options, but we can only bring you back options for the land that we own and administer.
Sorry, just one thing I would say is that there's strong collaboration occurring at an office level between Kāinga Ora and council officers as part of that wider master planning for the neighbourhood. So as been alluded to in the report and answering the questions, the conversations to date with Kāinga Ora are supportive of the Kahongareo and a balance of housing, subject to a conversation about the nature and type of that housing, but that conversation is occurring within a broader level of collaboration between council and Kāinga Ora on the wider master plan, for want of a better term, for the neighbourhood.
Thank you. So just to understand then, will some of that context be continued to be wrapped around what we see in terms of information coming to the council table?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess what I'm highlighting to you here in the recommendation is that it's a bit like Summerhays Street. We gave consideration to the wider housing context, but the decisions you need to make to advance a proposal to go out for consultation and the changes under the Reserves Act have to relate to the parcel of land that we administer under that Act.
Thank you for clarifying that. Final question I had, Madam Chair, is just, I think it's Opi Reserve is the reserve that's currently being used for the Kahongareo. And just wondering, any considerations around future use or transition there if the Kahongareo moves? Is that a separate piece of work, or does that sort of get wrapped up in here?
Yeah, so the Kahongareo use Opi Reserve as their open green space. The building they occupy isn't on Opi Reserve, and it's a privately owned property.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying, Madam Chair.
Councillor Naylor.
Chair. Just looking at some of the other options that are presented in the paper, in particular option 4, on page 23, under the financial information in 5.29, it doesn't really give us a lot of an I haven't sort of got a sense from this paper what the financial value of the land is. So in that, under that option, it talks about being able to potentially have 10 350 square metre sections with potentially over 30 houses if multi-unit, you know, if there was a multi-unit approach. Do we have an understanding of the approximate, if we were to go with that value, that option, do we have an understanding of the approximate value of that land if it was used in that way?
No, we don't. We considered when we were preparing this report that we would need for this, would need to understand what conditions were placed under the land use consent, therefore what would be the costs of developing those sections, and therefore what the net return would be, and that's quite a substantial piece of work to do without first having a council direction that you want that pursued.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. It's just a follow-up question around the consultation that would occur, assuming these recommendations pass today. So just at the end of the report, it talks about community engagement will occur. Can you give us a sense of whether that's just in the local area or is it across the city? And would that give scope for other organisations that are looking for a piece of land for their community facility to be considered? Or if we make the recommendation, if we pass these recommendations today, does that lock in the Kohanga-reo?
That locks in the Kohanga-reo as your preferred option, in effect. So we'd be going out to consulting with the community about our intention to enter into a lease for part of the land. There's also, because the activity is not compatible with the nature of the land, there's also a land use process or a consent process associated with this. And then obviously we would take that feedback, hear submissions in the same way we would do under any other Reserves Act process. People in the immediate area would be notified of Council's preferred option, but Council would be seeking submissions from anybody within the community. So yes, it is a very wide process and it will take us some time.
Okay. And my other question is just to you, Madam Chair. I'm just finding it a little bit uncomfortable that Mr. Whaipu is on the benches but not able to speak. Are we able to allow him to make some comments? Because I think that might be helpful in determining the decision making.
At this stage, I'm just going to leave it to the officers presenting because I think we've heard a summary of the views. I think the report quite clearly states the strategic position of the hapu and what they're trying to achieve. And so because this is, it's not quite the beginning, but it's early on in the process, there'll be other opportunities to hear.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael and Kathy. We don't have any further questions. So I'll move the three recommendations. Recommendation 3, there's just a typo in that the report comes back to planning and strategy before going to council. So that's the only change from the order papers. That is seconded, those three recommendations are seconded by Councillor Hancock. And I will open up for any comments. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm finding this a bit of a difficult one, to be honest, because, and I think the officers summed it up quite well, there's conflicting strategic directions here, and there's also a bit of a lack of information to help us with the decision making. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to do yet, to be honest. I know I'm supposed to speak for or against, but my problem is, I suppose, that in principle, I think it's a great opportunity for the Kohanga-reo to expand, particularly in an area that's got, you know, a very young demographic and where there will be increasing needs for it in the years to come. And so I'm open to the idea of a lease of council land for that purpose. I think that's great. Then we come on to the Opi Reserve itself. and I'm not really sure whether only using half of it is useful to either purpose. Whether we might be better to either go for the full amount for the kohanga reo or the full amount for housing, but it seems to me that chopping it in half isn't necessarily going to achieve either aim to a good degree. And then I'm really unsure about the Kāinga Ora development plans for the area, and whether we might be acting a bit too soon before we actually know what their plans are and whether or not we should be partnering with them to achieve a housing outcome. And then we've got the issue of other groups also wanting a piece of council land for their facilities, and how do we balance competing needs when they haven't really been given the opportunity to put in an expression of interest for this piece of land too. So all of that leads me to be a bit unsure about how to proceed with this decision at the moment. And so I'm yet to make up my mind, colleagues. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I'm generally in favour of this. I mean, Ngāti Hiniatu hapu are an important hapu for our city, and we should be trying to accommodate what they're looking for. Like Councillor Johnson, I'm really torn a little bit in the sense that we're either Kāinga Ora have a wider plan for this neighbourhood. They come to see the offices, but also my office regularly, and I know that there is quite a lot planned in this space. So I'm feeling quite comfortable that we can do something with this land in the proper way. But I do wonder if option 3, the exclusive use, is somewhat better way of dealing with it. So I will put, if this fails, I will signal, and seconded by Councillor Finlay, that option 3, exclusive use, so we can get some sort of understanding of what the hapu want to do, is on the table if this fails. But I'm generally supportive of where we're going. I did find that we were tying ourselves up in knots a little bit. I mean, I liked what Councillor Dingwell was talking about with some papakāinga type housing, which I thought could possibly work as well. It has for Te Tihi within that vicinity at Botanical Road, so why couldn't it work there? But anyway, I think you should support this. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Look, I'll be very brief. I'm actually going to support this. The change in reserve status actually triggers a requirement for us to consult. That will stimulate some local views in terms of what we should do with the piece of land, and that might actually open up a wider conversation about whole or part or some other options. So I'm very happy to support it.
Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like Councillor Johnson and the Mayor, I'm finding this one really difficult. I think I am actually leaning more towards option 3, exclusive use for Ngāti Hiniatu of this land, and mainly because they've been struggling to get a kohanga reo for well over a year, and that's just in the negotiations that they've had with us. And this is the 3rd site that they've looked at, and they want to have a site that's within their existing community. And those are starting to become, more and more difficult to get to. I'm leaning towards sort of supporting this, but only because the recommendations in front of us, but only because I'm afraid that if I say no to it, we might lose the whole shebang. So it's one of those really difficult positions where I feel like if we'd had more information about what the hapu wants for this land, it would have been easier for us to make these calls. So what I'm going to do in this instance, right now, because this is the only info I've got, is I'm going to say no to this one, and if it fails, support the Mayor with option 3, and see how things go from there.
Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the Mayor said, I will second option 3. I believe that the Karangaroo, even though they only need half of it at this stage, Ngāti Heniotu will have probably a lot of other ideas that they could use the other part of the land for, other than an urban marae. When you have a look at the other social organisations within the Highbury area, that they keep expanding. The need is in that area is huge. And for Ngāti Heniotu to have a bit of land available to be able to do something along the social side of things, I think would be very beneficial for the area and the city. So I won't support option 2. I will vote against option 2, but I will vote for option 3.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to support the recommendations that they've been put forward, and I like the tag on with the Planning and Strategy Committee report coming back on housing. As far as the alternate option being proposed with option 3, leasing exclusively the whole parcel, to be honest, I actually think, without murkying the waters, option 5 would sit better with me, where, where half of it is leased, that's all they're asking for, and the balance is left for a land bank for future and community facilities for the wider Highbury community. We know there's been the martial arts request that could have a site on that space, and a bit like behind the racecourse where there's pipe band, the rifle range and the Deaf Society or whatever else, it's like a little cluster of buildings that are all kind of not always in great shape, but they sit together as a cluster, and this space here potentially, option 5 would sit better for that, because it comes around to resourcing. Are we going to lease the whole lot to the hapu when a question of capacity, resourcing? It's going to take a fair bit of resourcing to build the kohanga, and we haven't even asked that question. So let's not get it too far ahead of ourselves and with the expectations around that. I know there will be some desires, but they also have, as been reported, desires for an urban marae, which is a larger piece of land somewhere else. And so we just got to, I think, just put that in perspective when the time comes, when that gets identified, to support that direction fully. So it's around being pragmatic. I think there is a need around housing. There has been an overlay with Karangaora, and this here potentially doesn't commit us. It's doing some investigation work in part in the first instance with a report back to this committee for the other half of the land. And that's still reserves our opportunity to land bank it or go down that option 5 route. So I'm comfortable with how you posed it, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this point, I can't support this because we haven't got enough information. So I'm actually going to move that this lies on the table. What I want to see come back to council, I would like to see reports back from the hapu. And I would also like to see what the plans are for Kaingaora in the future, because there may be an opportunity, because we haven't, Kaingaora have got land, which is not shown on here.
Councillor Beattie, I'll just ask you to just give a brief explanation for your procedural motion, and then we'll go to that, because lying it on the table is a procedural motion, so there's not an opportunity for full comment.
And I can talk to it.
I believe you can explain why it's...
Well, I am explaining it because we haven't got enough information to make the decision. That's the explanation.
Is there a seconder for the procedural motion? Councillor Naylor, thank you.
And the reason we haven't got the information from the hapu, they haven't spoken today. We haven't got the information from Kaingaora. And I would like to see a plan for that whole area to see what Kaingaora want to do. And because if we give permission just for one group, it may be that there could be possibilities that we do land swaps, that whole spatial area. And Opi Place is one of the lower socio-economic areas of the city, and we've got an opportunity here to actually look at that in its entirety and build it up. So I support going forward, but not just yet. I just would like all the information. So I just think, and councillors have already said they're in two minds, so let's get the information and let's do something properly, not just ad hoc. And so first we heard of it was, you know, in our council bags last week. So let's just take a month or two and get the information. We're not opposing it, but let's just get the information. Thank you.
We have a procedural motion in front of us, so I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 11 votes in favour with none against. So moving on to the committee work schedule on page 27. I'll invite David to provide any comments to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have no specific comment on the work schedule this morning.
Are there any questions on the work schedule? Great. I will move that the Planning and Strategy Committee receive its work schedule dated November 2021, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments? Councillor Naylor? I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Nō reira, na mihi noi ki e koutou, ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'll hand it over to the Mayor for the workshop.
Sorry, hospital pass. Okay, we're going to have a break and we'll be back in the chamber for the workshop just after 10 o'clock. Thank you. Sorry? Oh, okay, Missoula Room, is it? I don't know the staff running it, so yeah, thank you.